day, one and all. Welcome to the TELSIG podcast. I'm Phil Martin from the University of York. The topic on the table today is machine translation of the audio variety. So that's students using devices in class to subtitle teachers and sometimes each other. Something, again, that's proven fairly divisive. Depending on who you listen to, it's either a great leveller, allowing international students to compete on equal footing with their English-speaking peers, or it's a debilitating crutch that gets in the way of learning. My colleagues here at York, James Lamont and Andy Cirocki, have just published a study on this very topic. It came out in Jolt earlier this year. I'll let James introduce that because he is today's guest. And we're joined also by Jiaoyue Chen, who's an academic practice advisor here at York. And Jiaoyue's got extensive experience in SoTL, linguistics and language teaching. So it's great to have her in the conversation. We talk about some of the opportunities of this technology, lecturers' frustrations, the impact on language acquisition, ethics and acceptability, data protection, and a bunch more. And with that, I bring you James Lamont and Jiaoyue Chen. James, you're not new. You've been here before.
Yeah, I was part of your session in December. It was great.
And I think we talked about machine translation then.
Yeah. I just finished writing the paper and it had just been published, so I was really happy about that.
Cool. So when was this out?
It was published in December.
Okay.
Just before the end of the year.
Cool. So, Jiaoyue, you're new. You're from an English teaching background. Give us your credentials. What's your role here? What do you do?
So we actually merged into a new team. It's called Academic Quality and Development Team. So my background is Applied Linguistics for Teaching and Learning. So I spent last 10 years in this area as a researcher and as a teacher, and then moved on to a role more focusing on the academic practice advisor, so help people to support new academics and academics into teaching in higher education in the UK.
Oh, so what was your research specialism?
It's quite interesting. It's on formulaic language. Basically, I look at the chunks how second language learner use the fixed expression, including chunks, larger one or smaller one, in their writing, in English, second language writing. Yeah.
I think when we spoke before, you said you were into corpus linguistics before. Is that right?
Yeah.
Part of your... Okay.
Basically look at the people, how to, their frequencies and the patterns in their written language, and trying to explore why learners use such kind of language expressions in that way, in that context. What that really mean for them and for the reader.
All right, so we've got the paper to hand here. I'll let James introduce this first, but then I'd like to get us onto our own sort of experiences of working with machine translations. We're all language learners as well, so it'd be cool to get onto that. James, give us the overview of the paper first. What was the study you've been working on with Andy?
My paper is called Talking to Algorithms, Not Students and Lecturers' Perceptions of Machine Translation in Academic Discussion. So this came about because I teach academic skills to a group of education students, master's students in education. And I noticed that often when I was monitoring their behavior, I'd often see that students were on their phones. And of course, I thought I had to, go and check, are they actually participating in class? Are they just on social media? Are they buying trousers or whatever? So I'd noticed that a lot of them were just my words were appearing on their phones with a direct translation into their native language, usually Chinese. And this was kind of mind-blowing at the time. This was back in 2023. So, just exploring this, I noticed that more and more students were using simultaneous translation and transcription of everything I was saying. So I started doing research about this, and I discovered that there's a lot of work on student use of machine translation, but most of it's focused on reading and writing for assessment rather than in participation and engagement, which is what we were seeing here. So we're seeing students using translation in order to participate in class, to communicate with other students, to listen to the teacher, to understand instructions. And so there seemed to be a gap in the research here, which I wanted to explore. So I investigated through two questionnaires. I sent out one questionnaire to students and one questionnaire to teachers. And then we ran a focus group. So we had 3 research questions. We were investigated in in which situations do students use machine translation? So lectures, seminars, supervisor meetings, etc. We're interested in why they use them, lots of their self-given reasons for using machine translation in these contexts. And thirdly, what's the difference between students' and lecturers' attitudes regarding machine translation use in these contexts?
A bit of background on this subject generally, because we've had Mike Groves and Klaus Mund on the podcast before, and I think when people think of machine translation, their work's been really influential, but they've mainly focused on use in reading and writing.
Yeah.
And your primary focus here is its use in the seminar room. Is that more of it would be more of a recent development as the technology's progressed, because this real-time subtitling thing, which we've noticed, I guess that would be the last 3 years, was they started writing about this in 2015 or so.
Yeah. So like Groves and Munt's, one of their best papers, the one we used from 2021. So they investigated teachers. They asked a bunch of teachers at universities like how they felt about this, and it was largely focused on reading and writing with a particular focus on assessments. Yeah, but it's a really good paper and absolutely worth reading. Probably one of the best in the field about this topic. So yeah, like it's a very recent technological development, and it's quite impressive to see students absolutely on top of these technological developments. But more recently, we're seeing students with earphones on in class all the time, so being able to receive simultaneous translation into their earphones. So they're receiving like an audio interpretation of the lecturer speaking as they go, as the lecturer speaks, which is obviously technologically amazing, but pedagogically and in terms of student engagement, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
So, Joe, you're a lecturer in EAP. You're working as an educational advisor, but you're coming from Mandarin. Is your L1?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was one of the students in the in your as your participants.
Oh, there
I
goes your
was
anonymity.
once, yes, about 16, 17 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I came to the UK to study my master's.
How do you find machine translation as an EAP lecturer? When did you? Is this an issue in your current role? Has it been something that you've picked up on when you were teaching EAP?
I think I'm more tolerant than the lecturers and lecturers in the study.
Mm.
So I know the formulaic language terminology play a really big part when you trying to bridge up between the EGP to EAP. So the first thing I always come to my student is trying to find out the keywords and sort out the barrier in the first 2 or 3 weeks, trying to create the opportunities to create this kind of frequent encounters opportunities for them to come over these key terms over and over again. I give them time. I think that's biggest barrier.
So let's just zoom in on that for a minute, because I think with machine translation, you don't talk about this much in the paper, James, but you talk more about acceptability and obviously the perceptions from lecturers and students. But there's also the big issue about whether it's impacted, what's it actually doing for the language acquisition. Yeah. So we've got this situation. I mean, it's going to be slightly different if you're using it to write versus using it to speak. But I can see it, the bypassing of this thing that, Joe, you're talking about. You want to get students exposed to keywords in meaningful ways. You want to get this kind of draw their attention to how the word is situated in a sentence. And this, these repeated exposures in different contexts kind of
at early on.
Yeah. And that's this is the bit that the machine translation can be bypassing, right? Yeah. Because what you're doing a quick check, and then you're saying the word, or you're having it real time translated. Your brain's not doing any of the heavy lifting. Yeah. So it seems like there's an implication here for it's impeding acquisition in some way. So what's your? I mean, James, we'll go back to you for a sec, because you didn't really talk about this a huge amount in the paper. Was it something you were thinking about when you were interviewing? Or
Yeah, it was. And this is something which the students bring up a lot in their responses. They say that, it can get in the way of learning, like it's useful as a quick tool, but you do have to study the language yourself. And so that is obviously a real concern, is that there is, like, if the AI translation can do this for you, then why learn it for yourself? This is the motivation issue. But there's also, the cognitive issue of perhaps it will reduce your ability to pick up these words. Whether if you translate a phrase, will it have the same memory effects as it would through translating it yourself, for trying to understand it yourself? So that's a real question, I think.
Yeah, I remember encountering an early form of that. I'm going to show my age here, but back in 2006, when I was teaching a general language class, there was this one particular student. He had at the time a dictionary on his laptop, which in 2006 was amazing. Like electronic, you could look up the word and it would give you this thing. And I remember sitting there with this student, and we were basically a conversation class where the idea was we were working on fluency, automaticity, and kind of vocab building. And there were things he wanted to say, and he would quickly, he'd get frustrated, check the dictionary and say the word that the dictionary would spit out,
Yeah.
and move on. And the thing that I noticed that he kept re-looking up the same word.
Yeah.
So it struck me straight away, even 20 years ago, as this is not a good way of, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not going through the motions that we need to go to properly acquire this vocab. So, Jiaoyue, actually, just as a language learner, can you relate to any of this? How did you...
So when I started my master's, what I did is for my first couple of weeks, as soon as sitting in the classroom, I find, okay, people use slightly different terms. So what the terms I've learned used in my past 4 years in my undergraduate study is very different from some of the terms here, because no one talks about Noam Chomsky. And I did my English major in China, so I have to read a lot with intentional goal as a learner. So I know it's blank, I'm blank in that area. So I have to learn that. And also another thing is I kind of list all the key terms across, you come across the key terms, keywords in that subject, in the module. So I kind of have a key terms for myself, trying to understand what the translation into Chinese and the English. So this is really, really beneficial for me because I can read both sides in terms of articles later on, rather than just choose, everything has to be in English or everything has to be Chinese, and then, doing translation. Because we're trying to find where they are exactly. That's really, really helpful. Because I think that's go back to James' article. It's about, I think some of the lecturers wanted a student to be very competent and, just do things in English. But then they didn't really think about, the second language as a resource. Sorry, their first language as a resource, actually, is a foundation. Start with something you're familiar. You're trying to understand the perspective, but in another language.
Yeah, so just to drill into the context a little bit. So all of the participants of your study were they all from the Department of Education?
Yeah, they were all students doing MA in education.
Okay. So was the acquisition of English part of the learning outcomes of the modules that they were?
No, there was an assumption that students would have the English skills to be able to participate in the module. In my class, so originally my course has been going on for about 5 years. Originally, it was much more EAP heavy, but it's become much more focused on academic skills, like understanding particular genres, understanding what a good essay looks like, how to cite correctly, that sort of thing. And it moves on from that into more complicated terms, like how do you write an effective comparison in an essay, those sort of skills. But I mean, something I wanted to bring up based on what you were talking about was we teach this class mainly through like tasks. So it's like engage in this, do this task together, talk about how you're doing it. But machine translation tools were often used, it felt, to complete the task effectively and quickly. But there was, as going back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, there seemed to be an almost effort to bypass the actual learning component. Like the goal of the class is not to do the tasks. The goal of the class is to learn things by doing these tasks. So these machine translation tools we use as a task completion mode, but they weren't really effective for learning such. So if you give students like a list of tasks and give them a translation tool, they seem to be very capable of using the translation tools to, to be able to communicate and understand what I was saying. But there didn't seem to be much contribution towards active engagement and learning, which was what we were really going for.
So I think, my question was mainly about what are we trying to get out of these? So mainly, in education, are you dealing mainly with international students there?
Yes.
Okay.
There would be 1 or 2 home students in the class.
Yeah, so is it kind of like a tacit acknowledgement that international students here studying in a target language, that although the aim is to learn all the things that you've been talking about, not explicit language learning goals, but that language acquisition is part of the curriculum?
Yeah, I think the implicit assumption there is definitely the key word there, because I feel that if you're doing a master's in like TESOL, teach English to speakers of other languages, then it would be being able to have an effective understanding of English linguistics is essential. But for other classes, English is the medium of instruction, but you are graded to some extent in your ability to write. But things like speaking, there's no assessment there. There's no requirement of the course to be able to actually speak the language capably. It's just this is assumed that you'll be able to do this through participation in classes, through living in the UK, and so on.
Yeah, so the idea is, but we would teach students EAP in preparation for these kind of higher skills which you're focusing on there. Okay, so when you talk about like they're actually bypassing, they're focusing on task completion, which kind of misses the point a little bit. The aim of these sessions, seminars, essays, whatever it is we're talking about, the aim is not to just complete things as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
It's about, to quote the great scholars Aerosmith, life's a journey, not a destination. Where was I? Yeah, so it's kind of it's getting us to the destination, but it's not really helping. So I can see how it would impede language learning a little bit, because you're bypassing all of that, the arduous acquisition process we normally go through. How about the education, the modules that you're dealing with on the education programs? What were the language learning outcomes, and what were the tasks? What are they bypassing there by using machine translation?
So that's a really interesting question, because for most of the modules, the assessment was just write an essay. So that made it very easy to teach an in-session EAP course, because it meant I could focus entirely on essay skills, like what does a good essay look like? Here's some exemplars. Let's analyze why they're effective. Let's analyze why this one got a good mark, why this one didn't get a good mark. And that's great from a student perspective, because it means I'm giving them like what they need to know. But fundamentally, but the goal is also to help students participate in seminars. And that's the trouble, is the seminars aren't assessed in any way. So students often saw that as like a secondary thing. But there was a goal of including students' speaking skills and listening skills as well. But clearly, if students were using machine translation to participate in it, to engage and speak to each other, then that's not really being achieved. But then that's not being assessed. So that leads to all kinds of, that's a very strange outcome.
So we could be talking about home students equally.
Yeah.
We could be saying, these are skills that they're not purely language learning skills. The art of presenting is something different in itself. Can we talk a little bit about being language learners? Because I know James and I were talking about this offline. So, Jiaoyue, can you talk to us a little bit about your journey? So English is not your first language. How did you study it? How did you acquire it? What things did you go through, and what were your study habits?
So I started to learn English from my mom's elder sister. She's a school teacher, English teacher. So just around 6, 7. And then we formally...
Oh, don't say that.
Parents in the room.
Simply exposure me to, how to pronounce the alpha beta table, some very simple words. And then the formal curriculum, the English come to the formal curriculum on my last year in my year 6, the last year in my primary school. And then in the junior high school, so basically you have that as one of your major subjects. So I was lucky because I was just... everything was quite open at the time. So got major influence from Western culture, like Backstreet Boys, music and the movie Titanic. So a lot of influence from music, film. And then on the other hand, you need to take it seriously, because you need to be very good, because one of the major subjects you have to basically excel in the exams. So like equivalent to the GCSE and A level, and then you secure a position in the university.
So did your English, was that entirely from school, or did you do anything else?
Nope.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, from school, in the class. Yeah. So everything is norm referencing. So you have to be really good. And normally if you are really lucky in a good class, you got really good, brilliant English teacher, and they will balance the 5 skills, not 4 skills. So basically listening, reading, writing, speaking, and the translation. So they do translation deliberately in the class. So basically you are trained to translate stuff from English into Chinese, and the other way around. So basically kind of have that kind of practice. And then with you progress into a much higher level, so basically they use less Chinese in the class, kind of reduce that translation process.
Was this period of your life before machine translation came in?
I think I started in 26. So I also used the e-dictionary. We call that e-dictionary.
In 2006?
Yeah, 2006. Okay. So I don't know, that maybe some of the dictionary, they're really good. They can translate large chunks of text. So that is about translation and use the dictionary. And then in terms of the machine translation, I use Google Translation when I did my master's. And sometimes, occasionally, I use translation nowadays, because when I come across some really, really long, complicated sentences, I'm trying to figure out what that really means.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's going back to your question about over-reliance.
Yeah, so one of the questions I had here was what does over-reliance look like? So I'll get to that in a minute. But James, give us you're into Korean. Are you using Google Translate as an assist here? Or?
Yeah, so I spent 2 months in Korea last year because my son was born there. So and during that time I entered a Korean class, and the Korean class was very different to how language teaching would be done over here. The teacher spoke a lot, would occasionally ask us a question, but there's very little like student-to-student interaction, very little asking questions or anything like that. So mainly just listening and writing down and things like that. So I'd make an effort to use Google Translate and to ask questions and to participate and use it as a dictionary. I also used Claude a lot if the teacher started talking about something and I didn't understand her explanation of it because it was all in Korean. So I just got it up, Claude explained how this grammar form worked. So that's a really helpful way for language learning to help to study language learning these days.
One of the things that I've found quite cool is the ability to, like, the more complex sentences. Because I think if you go back 20 years and we're relying even on the e-dictionaries, you kind of had to do things a little bit more word by word. Whereas word for word, kind of, you run up against a wall sometimes because together they mean something quite different, especially if you're going to and from a language where the grammar works really differently and you have to kind of uproot and relay each sentence and translate at sentence level. So it's really cool to be able to put a sentence in and compare it to what you thought it meant. But what I found is that you really need to do that heavy lifting first in order to get anything out of it. So I can write, for example, okay, I need to put this sentence together. I'm going to write it out in my target language first and then check Google Translate or translation app of choice and just see how far wide of the mark I was.
Yeah.
So I can do that. I can see how it would be really, really helpful. But it requires that self-regulation. You have to force yourself to go through the heavy lifting first in order to get anything out of it. Because if you're not going through that, and I think a lot of the students that you're talking about in the study, they're obviously not, just time pressures, you're just translating all the time. First of all, you're bypassing the heavy lifting, so you're not building the muscles, retention is going to become an issue. But the other thing that I've noticed certainly in the literature when we talk about AI, I think is this, because it's sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, is this false sense of confidence. Because you'll look at the translation and think, oh yeah, I knew that. Yeah. Okay, well, I understand. You think you understand it, but you don't, because the proficiency of the technology gives you this sort of sense of confidence. Yeah, that was my take on it. Did you get a sense of any? Again, it's more to do with the language learning, and I know your participants were more concerned about acceptability, but was this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think definitely you're onto something there. And there's a real parallel with how we use AI effectively, but you have to really think about what you want from it first, and then kind of do the work yourself, then use AI to check and enhance that. And I think a lot of our students I was encountering were basically coming to class, opening up the translation app and turning it on and basically using it for the entire translation app, entire duration of this class. That would be, I think, over-reliance on it, but you're not engaging at all, where it's coming entirely from that. There's no effort to try and understand things yourself. It's just that these are students who feel like they're constantly running after the language or trying to catch it, but they're constantly being chased by it. I can't imagine what it's like to participate in a class where you're constantly having everything translated, because the speaking speed of classes, even when you speak quite slowly, it's very high, and being able to try and read to catch up with that in your own language, in different languages, has got to be very, very challenging.
It is, and it's like there's a temptation to. Oh, there was a bit in your study. I'm trying to remember. I might have edited this bit out, but oh no, that was it. Yeah, so there was a little bit in there where there's a fear of taking it away.
Yeah,
and yeah, I'm interested if you guys have been through this as well as language learners, because I find like if I have my device here, if I have the ability to check something in real time, I'm convinced that I need to do that in order to understand. So if I'm like, oh God, what was that bit? Pause it. What was that? Hey, what was that? Whereas if I just let it go, turn it off, put it in a bag, and after a few seconds, that unease goes away and you start to understand more, and you can feel sort of automaticity building. Your recall function in your brain is kind of working as it should. Have you guys either experienced this, or
I think
how much sense does that
not
make?
necessarily in language learning, but in many aspects of technology enhanced life, maps, apps, and things like that. People are surprisingly capable at doing tasks themselves without technology being available. But the moment technology becomes available, you want to check it. Yeah. And I think bringing back to the study, there's a lot. In one of the papers, the Frith paper, there was a lot of emphasis on students wanting to know exactly the right word for every situation, and to be able to understand every single word. I think that's definitely a reflection of what you're talking about there. That perhaps getting it slightly wrong, but being able to be understood would be okay in this context. But students want to know exactly this word.
I think I had a thought. I come across first quotation in your paper, and also that kind of being shameful affair of using that machine translation tools in the class. I reflect on my previous teaching experience. I think I did a very opposite way, because if I know this word is really important or this term is very important, I would stop, ask a student to go and find the meaning of the word. Do that immediately, so they won't really feel upset in the subsequent couple of minutes or hours in the session. But then again, I compare the student cohort, because my student was very, I think they're quite stronger in terms of language and in terms of academic performance in general, achievement in general. So I think, if we really kind of ask questions a little bit further, what has made the student doing things like that, why they use that. So that's kind of recall some of my memory about different teaching methods in second language localization. For example, people use audio visual or grammar translation or communicative teaching method, depend what student has been experienced in their previous classroom. One thing I could think is maybe it's a possible explanation, because all the students come to the UK broadly, more majorly from China. They have to experience heavily exam-oriented experience. So everything is basically to aim for achieving high scores in IELTS, aka you don't make a mistake. So that's why they want accuracy. They won't really let go any piece of information, trying to make sure they know everything. And also that link to the grammar translation method, right? So basically word to word. So I think that's kind of, if you have that experience for like 10 years.
Yeah. But there's an irony in that, because you're demonstrating surface level accuracy, but that accuracy in the moment is coming at the expense of what you're actually learning.
Because I think people have different conceptions of learning. Because I feel like the sense of, the joy of learning when I came here after 3 or 4 months, I really feel like, okay, the first time I'm learning for learning. I study for study, not for an exam, not for the score. I don't care about score, because I know I will be doing good, because I did everything I could. I just enjoy as you said, the journey.
I think we forget that sometimes, because it's like, we're now learning languages. Like, we've got goals, but we don't have the pressure that our students have. This kind of like the huge fees, the expectations from parents, future employers. You have to get this, and they're terrified of not getting things 100% right.
And one of the main themes that came up again when I was talking to lecturers was about like students being given offers when they weren't
not
capable
ready.
of participating, when their IELTS scores were too low, and their entry requirements were too low. So there's a lot of frustration among lecturers about this students' ability to participate, and they noticed that it was the students who use translation tend to have weaker levels of English language proficiency than other students, but also the machine translation didn't seem to help. It seemed to get them through, as you say, through the situation. But it didn't lead to any kind of long-term development. It led to a kind of dependency on machine translation in the long term.
Yeah, and then that's widening the gap.
Yeah.
So, because I think I've read this, you mentioned it in your paper, and I think I've read it in elsewhere as well. It's the weaker students that are disproportionately affected by the debilitating effects of technology of over-reliance. Am I getting this mixed up with another paper? Was there a big cry for policy from the lecturers that you were talking to?
There was some cry for policy. Yeah, I mean, that's generally an issue, is that I think universities across the UK do not have adequate policies to deal with either this or AI to a lesser extent. Like with AI, people are starting to take it more seriously. But the risk is that now that generative AI is the main focus in technology, but things like machine translation get kind of swept under the rug because no one cares about them anymore.
But because I think whether we're talking about any sort of technology policy and how much assistance is positive, these policy documents, they invariably get produced. They're invariably quite lengthy, and they contain words like over-reliance. And, by all means use it constructively, but do not over-rely. It doesn't really clear anything up for anyone because this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand, what does over-reliance look like in practice? What's healthy? Where's the line? Do you guys have any intuitions about this that would look good on paper as a policy?
As you say, like a lot of the time, the university will produce like a policy document, 12 pages, designed for other lecturers, designed to be read once and used as a reference for if you want to have a meeting with a student or something. But I don't think it's really very student friendly. Perhaps a clear discussion at the start would help. But the problem is that it's for students using machine translation and probably those less likely to engage in such discussion, owing to like inability to engage in the class, tech dependency, and so on. So that creates a real risk. But I think perhaps just more discussion over what does learning look like? What's the purpose of this class? Why are you here? What are you going to get out of this would always be very helpful.
I quite like the phrase you use in your paper is you use communicative and participatory activities, because I think that's really big shift or transition for the students, many from East Asia. So if they sitting there, get used to be silent in the classroom for previous 12 years, 18 years, and then suddenly we ask them to be, communicative, willing to talk to everyone and be talkative. Well, that's a really big jump for them.
It's a huge task.
So I think that should be, as you said, should be clearly communicate to the student what we expect you as a student. There might be some, different expectation, and to make the session effective. So I need your input as well as a participants to do more communicative activities and tasks in the classroom. So I think that should be more clearer.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, we expect that, but they didn't really do that.
So we can have an education strand. I mean, the last couple of podcasts we've had, the discussions have focused around really setting boundaries around tech in the classroom. And I think, I'm not sure if you guys listened to the last one, but Paul Kirshner was on. He was very strict about just the idea of phones harm learning. We didn't talk specifically about machine translation, but the devices are distractions. They're getting in the way of learning. You remove them, you will notice the learning gains. And if you don't drink or eat in the classroom, why not just have the same policy for phones? And if you applied that here and if you translated that into policy, you'd get past the idea of you'd be able to say, look, I know this is going to be uncomfortable for a minute, and I know this is not what you're used to, but putting these away is step one. So is this, do you have any thoughts about this? Would a phone, I'm hesitant to use the word ban, just telling students to, because it's the wrong word. It's like just building a culture where you keep phones in your bags. Just easier said than done. But what do you think about this, James? I think we might have talked about this on the last time we were on. But what's if we want a policy that's just simple and effective? Any arguments against that? Do you think?
I'm quite sympathetic to it. I think that what would be, rather than a phone ban, like put your phone away for the class, I think structuring the class in a way that here's phone time, here's non-phone time, and creating different kind of activities which make the use of smartphones versus not doing that. I'm inspired by Michael Gerlich's latest paper. He talks about how we can use AI in a more constructive way to spur critical thinking, and it's basically like planning and discussing by yourself, and then using AI to be able to check and get details that you need and use counter arguments, and then writing something, and then using AI for to get feedback on it. So basically, like what we were talking about, like you have to do the heavy lifting yourself, do the thinking for yourself, and then use AI, use tech to enhance that. So possibly creating something similar with AI, with translation software. So like giving students like a simple discussion task first, then say like like maybe just brainstorming. They could use translation software and things for brainstorming, so they can translate their ideas from one language to another. And then having like a non-phone time where we focus on discussion. So clear segmentation of tasks would be effective, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, reflect your paper's content. I feel like it's quite interesting because you find that, when students use machine translation, you said the majority would be on the vocabulary level and the sentence level. And then you said there's a big discrepancy in terms of language proficiency in one cohort. So I was wondering if the students, if the learner is much stronger in terms of language and compared to those who are less stronger in terms of English language, can we do something to support those people really, really struggle with their language? Because I said, well, if you can't really communicate people at that level, how old are you? That's not work. No matter how the lecturers, how the teachers, how the support roles, tutors will help you, you have to spend the time to really overcome that threshold to be able to join the conversation without or with machine learning. Because
the issue is that from the experience, machine translation doesn't actually encourage engagement, it seems. It leads to like disengagement. So if the more that we allow students to use this tool, the less likely they'll be to actually engage in some kind of communicative or participatory task. So I'm not sure, maybe having some clear preparation time with clear expectations about what kind of vocabulary you're going to need, that would be helpful. But that's a good practice to be able to teach students to think about, using tech effectively to prepare, having clear goals for what you want for this, and then being able to apply that yourself. That may help.
I don't know whether that's going to be part of the academic skills curriculum that for the students, because I think even with that one academic skills curriculum, we do need to really look at the student at different proficiency level, because there's nothing we can do because it's already the reality. They are here. And then sometimes we do need to articulate to the students saying, look, you need to try harder to be able to really, this is the expectation.
So when you say you need to try harder, would that be using a dictionary or something like that to gain the vocabulary they need? Or
well, at least you need to able to answer the question, how old are you?
Yeah.
That's
it's possible that the issue here is, there's issues. I mentioned accents and things like that are an issue working at international university. A lot of our students don't have exposure to certain kinds of accents. But I agree, students should be able to answer a question, how old are you? If they have passed the entrance exam requirements, then they should be able to respond to that effectively.
And also, I think there's another thing you mentioned about the lectures' perceptions in terms of, and the student perceptions. There's a couple of points. They said, students said that the teacher speak too fast. And they're trying to understand every sentence the teacher said. So I think, they're actually, if you look at it from the teachers, the teaching delivery in the session might be means, the teacher speaks too fast. Also, it could mean articulations or intelligibility of the speech in the classroom, whether it's clear enough, or students how many months do you allow students to get used to your accent. I think that's quite interesting. And also whether you use idiomatic expressions without knowing you are using idiomatic expressions, right?
Yeah, I think listening to you talk about that is what I mean. Yeah, so accents thing, idiomatic expressions. I just honestly don't see how using machine in the classroom, outside the classroom, yes, you've scribbled a few things down. I'll check that when I get out. But in the class, so if you're using MT, presumably on the phone, I guess we're mostly talking about phones here. As you're checking, you're then missing the next stream. Your brain's unhooked from the flow of language that's coming your way, and you're engaged with another task. So you're missing key content. And even if you look at it from a language learning point of view, okay, I'm listening to a lecturer talk about theories of education. Language learning is not part of what they're talking about, but I'm, part of what I'm doing here is developing my automaticity. I'm developing my listening fluency. as soon as you bring a phone with MT, with machine translation into the mix, you're off task. It's not, you're missing an opportunity to continue developing. I think what the problem is that you feel progress. If it gives you a translation, you've got something tangible. Okay, I've got that in my L1. Right, that's a phrase. I now know what that means. It feels like you've done something. Whereas if you're listening to a stream of language that you understand maybe 50% of, it doesn't feel like you're getting anything out of that. But you are. Every time you listen to that, you are building those recall muscles.
One of the best, the best products of technology, of EdTech in particular, is reassurance. It makes you feel like you know what you're doing. Yes. Makes you feel comfortable. It makes you feel safe. And removing that can be quite a shock. It can be quite worrying to not feel that reassurance anymore.
I think also another question, a very interesting point you mentioned in your paper. You said, well, the students, some students, they don't feel confident in their English listening skills, and a certain percentage report they feeling more confident reading text in their L1 than listening in their L2.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, have you asked the student whether they feel more confident in reading text in their L1 than listening to the text in L1?
Yeah.
Because I think again it's about approach to learning, whether you are more rely on your visual approach, your audio.
It's definitely a really interesting question because, as you say, like translation software turns spoken English into reading, into basically a reading task. And I've always held that one of the goals of the class should be to improve students' speaking and listening skills. That was one of the overall tasks set to me by the department, was improve students' seminar performance. So ultimately, we should be encouraging students to speak and listen effectively. Generally, a lot of the time, students have automatic software on a computer which automatically translates any text I send them. So generally, when I'll see students, they'll sneakily have the text translated into the native language. When I come around, they'll switch it off and switch it back on when they think I've walked past. So yeah, what can you do? So that's it's the interesting question is, would they prefer to read it in their home language or not? Most of the time, I think yes.
Because I think that's another thing we can really help to support students, because once they got large machine-translated scripts, so we can identify the genre of the lectures, even in their first language, and then turn that go back to the English version. So identify the gist, the key points, so they can let the minor information go and grasp the main point. That's for the weaker learner. So we can use, we observe the behavior, machine translation in the class, but I think it might be worth to look into how people are going to use that machine translation as a product to support their further learning.
Yeah, it was one of the articles you cited earlier. I think this is quite early on in your paper. You talked about a study which is about Russian students. They were
Huazhong,
and the conclusion of the study was students understood more when they had subtitles on their L1.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, yeah. No kidding. But I mean, it's sort of, I think this, you need to separate out like student anxiety from what we want to achieve from this stuff. Because it's like, you kind of need anxiety. Anxiety is like, it spurs you on, right? It's every time you learn something, there's usually this pain involved in the process. You're like, oh my God, I've messed that up. I knew that word and I didn't pick it up. Or you check certain amount of feeling foolish and just kind of accepting that as part of the process and not worrying so much about just living with the anxiety for a while until it.
What if the student already being in anxiety for a very long term?
Yeah, but do you see what I mean? There's two different goals going on. So we can make the students feel comfortable and they can understand the content. But if one of the goals is to work on language proficiency, then there's a trade-off, right?
Yeah. Yes. Because I just feel like, I don't know much about the other student from other nationalities, but I understand, things has changed a lot in East Asia. Everyone was superly stressed out. And then I think maybe we could, and coupled by the anxiety from lecturers, you said in your paper, I feel like, well, maybe we should create some soothing environment, maybe. in the class rather than bring more anxiety, because I feel like they already been there.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And then just give up everything, just lay flat, just turn on the machine translation.
Couldn't we just sort of already say the seminar room is already supposed to be a pretty safe place?
Mm.
So even if you didn't have MT and you have that anxiety, really you're not in a high stakes situation. It's fine to make mistakes. Maybe we could do a better job of instilling that atmosphere in the classes. But we can remove that crutch and nothing bad will happen.
Yeah.
The worst you might feel is a little bit of doubt sometimes about your abilities, but that is a necessary evil.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Because I notice some strange dynamics when you have a group of Chinese students. Years ago when I teach on the professional program in Southampton, you have a group of students come from one ethnic group. They are more stressed. If you have some international cohort, they will be relaxed.
In a more mixed group. Yeah.
You can sense that, but I don't know. I just feel like, maybe it's something very, you can call it second language anxiety, or it's something bigger. Strange things bring to the class. I don't know if James come across that.
So generally, because the classes I was teaching back here were 85% Chinese students, there'd be a few students from Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, Japan, etc. Most of the groups were entirely Chinese. There'd be one or two groups where it'd have an extra, a non-Chinese student. And you could see that, the engagement and effort to try and speak in English to include this student were quite strong. But at the same time, I couldn't really speak to the anxiety levels of those students.
It's not anxiety, it's kind of strange.
Yeah.
You can sense that. But, I think it's also, again, go back to the intercultural groups of learners and that communication stuff.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time. I'll squeeze a couple more points in here. Before I want to get to some sort of practical takeaways for teachers. So thinking about how to manage machine translation in class so that it's sort of productive, maybe gets a balance of the things that we've been talking about. But before I got onto that, I just wanted to ask you about, you included a quote in the paper from an early Groves and Mund paper, and I think this was 2015, and I remember listening to Mike and Klaus talk about this before, and they really sort of saw machine translation as this kind of freeing up our attention space to focus on higher order things. So I think Mike particularly said, you'd be delighted if you never have to teach subject-verb agreement again, and then, machine translation, irrespective of your basic sentence level competency, is going to allow us to focus on the really cool stuff like, discourse analysis. So I reading that now, I have some issues with that, but what did you guys, have we got there? Or?
I think that their text it's very optimistic, and I think that things haven't really panned out as they were hoping for, which is a real shame. Definitely I agree with them, but it'd be great to focus more on in-depth textual analysis and really get students to get what they need from text rather than dealing with more sort of more basic problems which are getting in the way. But from my experience of teaching in classes from this research, it seems like it has not resulted in what they expected. It's 2015 was a very optimistic time in EdTech.
It was new, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I thought, this could change everything.
Yeah.
Good old days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to, jump into is about James' point about the lecturers' concerns about student use of machine translation. It's about data and privacy, especially a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
I
think we almost missed that, but I think that's quite interesting.
I just want to bring this up as well because it's a real problem that if you've got classes being recorded, it undermines what you were saying about a seminar room being a safe space, and it also shows that a lack of care for the rights of other seminar participants if you're recording, because if you're using machine translation, everything's being recorded, and that means that any discussion of, say, difficult or sensitive issues is going to be there forever. And that undermines one of the goals of a university seminar, which is to be able to discuss these ideas and in an open and safe environment to be able to really get to what ideas are about. It discourages communication. So there's a risk that if one student is using machine translation, that's going to have ripple effects on the other students as well, and for the lecturers too.
And also another thing related to the students feeling shame or fearful is because they think they do something not right. And where I think there's not open communication between the teacher and the student saying, I'm not comfortable if you're doing this. And be careful, be mindful about the data privacy and the protection stuff. And I don't think a student realize there's such a thing called data protection or privacy. So that need to be part of the curriculum or induction program.
Yeah. But again, and definitely talking about the shame aspect is important as well, because throughout the data consistently showed that students felt it was wrong to use machine translation. Students were critical of other students' use of machine translation. Students felt, I don't want to use this, but I have to. So there was a consistent sense that machine translation does not have a good place in academic study, yet students used it anyway. So that's something we need to talk about, is how can students use this to benefit their learning? How can they use it to solve problems rather than how can they use it instead of learning? Yeah,
I mean, maybe we can tie those 2 points together, because I think just to add on the last point about data privacy, recording. So without permission, other students and teachers, and it being sent up to the cloud with a digital footprint that lasts. This is something that I'd never seen it addressed in the policy, but it sounds like it probably should be.
Yeah.
But we've also got the point which you mentioned earlier. I mean, we can talk to students about this until we're blue in the face and make a really compelling argument. But if they have that sense of shame, it's like, I can't fall behind, then they're going to do what, we've seen and you were talking about earlier, is like just furtively have this thing on and then switch the screen when the teacher's walking around or something like that. So it's very. Have you got any thoughts about how we would broach this with students?
I think you have to get student buy-in. Like, I can't see how you could enforce it if students aren't keen, because phones are so private that students could always have a phone recording translation without us noticing. We have to encourage student buy-in and understanding of how learning works, how they can develop their language skills, why it's worth developing your offline language skills, and really encouraging students through a conversation. I think bringing them on board is the only way to get that. I'm afraid that's a bit vague. I don't really have much more at this stage, but
I think the shame thing is definitely parallels conversations we've heard with AI.
Yeah.
Because, and I think Michael Gerlich was talking about this when he was, talking about his paper. So students using AI in class for formative discussion activities, they're consulting AI before and offering the response as a contribution to a seminar discussion, for example. And they're doing it. There's a certain shame. I don't think he said this. I think this is probably my inference. But there's a shame in doing that. It's like you're quite fearful of putting your own uncurated views across, especially when everyone else is using AI or everyone else is using machine translation and then have the appearance of perfectly fluent language proficiency. Everyone's kind of pushed into using it, even when they feel that they don't, they kind of understand already that it's not actually helping anything. Before we get on to some takeaways for teachers, James, Jiaoyue, any other aspects of the paper that you wanted to flag?
Certainly with this and with AI, development of AI, and what you were talking about now, this creates an opportunity for a new sort of integrated theory of learning. Like, how do we embed these tools into a learning process? How do we encourage students to use them in a way which doesn't make them feel shame? How do we encourage students to act by themselves if they need to, or act in support of these AI tools to help them to refine and clarify and enhance their ideas? So I think we could tie all this in together with like what Gerlich's talking about with AI, with generative AI tools and machine translation. So how can we develop students who can use what's available to develop and enhance their existing ideas, and also how can they work without these tools effectively?
I think definitely the digital elements should be integrated into the academic skills curriculum. So basically, when you develop the academic literacy equally, you need to students be equipped with the digital literacy for academic purposes together. And also another way is to look at, beyond the student behavior in the class. I think it's more interesting to look at why students behave in certain ways and what we can do as a teacher to support them within our roles and remit. And also, I think, machine translation, any digital tools is quite neutral. Depends how we use it. It's about, that's quite a trendy word for the AI agentic. It's about agency, right?
What would you guys like to see if we could build an ideal classroom as a perfect learning space?
A button that allows the teachers to turn the Wi-Fi off every once in a while and turn it back on again. Well,
does the
ideal
Wi-Fi
classroom, I guess so, yeah.
signal blocker?
Yeah, something which allows you basically to shift the classroom from technology enhanced mode to work by yourself mode, or something maybe that students could vote on, like they could do it by themselves. They have student groups sat together. They could have a set time where they work by themselves. If they decide this is our independent time and this is our technology enhanced time. So being able to the trouble with smartphones is one of the points which comes up again in this paper is they represent a real loss of control for the teacher. And this may not always be a bad thing, but sometimes it can be. And this means that teachers are less able to control what their students are doing in class and how their students are learning. So when students come here, I'm in favour of students bringing their own ideas, but I think at the same time, one of the reasons we're hired as teachers is that we have knowledge and skills about how to help students effectively learn things.
Yes.
And we should be able to apply those without being interrupted by smartphones and things like that.
Yeah, and I think they want, certainly
Students
I as
want
a
it.
student,
Yeah.
I don't want a teacher who just kind of lets us run free range.
Yeah.
It's good to have that curation and
Absolutely.
Jiaoyue, ideal classroom, what does it look like?
So both students and both learners and the teachers, they know the reason why they are in that space and the time.
Yeah. Future directions for this, James? You mentioned this is quite a small study.
Ideally, I'd like to do a much bigger study, and I'd like to talk much more about how it affects their language proficiency as well, like how students possibly, like we're talking about the confluence between AI and machine translation. So a wider study on EdTech and how it relates to language proficiency in general. Yeah,
Jiaoyue, as an academic developer and education, what's some cool research that could be done in this direction?
Well, I would like to see a lot of potential from this article to further develop into a piece of scholarship. So, you're going to hate me on this. So there's a difference between pedagogical research and scholarship. So basically, we can take away some, we can summarize some kind of came up with some key point for practice. So one way I think is we can create, for example, the machine translated text, as I said, for help the student to scaffold their listening and communicative skills to really recognize the genre and sentence, the patterns in language to get them familiarized early on in the curriculum when they come to the university. And then they can just sort out their content-based stuff themselves. I think it's, there's some definitely very a number of practical implications from the research. I think that's something really exciting to draw on, to look into.
Awesome. Okay, guys. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Any final thoughts you want to close us off on?
Just want to say, use your own mind and focus heavily on, AI can enhance, machine translation can enhance your understanding, it can develop it and can provide reassurance, but being able to work without these tools, that'll be a real skill in the future. That's something the students will really need.
Yes, that is something I say to the students, because I think all of the talk has been around working with the tech.
Yeah.
And I think it's got to the stage where if you want to stand out, be able to do this stuff yourself. I think that's going to be a...
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, UK workers, the minimum wage in the UK is quite high internationally compared to other countries. If suppose that somebody in a country with much lower average wage has access to Claude, knows how to use it, they're able to produce work which is probably of a similar standard to someone in the UK. So in order to make yourself competitive in a global marketplace, being able to work without AI tools as well as with AI tools is going to be absolutely essential.
On that note, one more time, what's the name of the paper, James? And we'll link in the show notes.
Talking to algorithms, not students. Students and lecturers' perceptions of machine translation in academic discussion. I'd just like to call out my good friend Andrew Cirocki, who was a co-writer in the paper, did a really great job here. We didn't really mention him throughout, so sorry about that. But it was definitely a co-production.
Nice one. Okay, Andy, shout out for you. Thanks a lot, as always. Oh, we did ask him on the podcast. He didn't want to come on. He said he doesn't like podcasts. So,
well, consider that congratulations rescinded, but yeah.
So we did meet for tea the other day. All right, thanks everyone. See you on the ice.